January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, thick and deliberate, blanketing the corpses of trees shattered by artillery fire. In a frozen foxhole carved into the hillside, Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffmann pressed his back against the frozen earth, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the gray morning air. He could hear it before he could see it, a low, mechanical growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself, rhythmic and relentless. His fingers, numb inside threadbare gloves, tightened around the grip of his Panzerfaust. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by the metallic squeal of treads grinding against snow and stone. Then it appeared through the tree line, an American M4 Sherman tank, its angular silhouette cutting through the winter mist like a steel apparition. Hoffmann had been told by his officers that the Sherman was inferior, a mechanical coffin easily pierced by German guns. Yet, as the machine rumbled forward, indifferent to the cold, to the terrain, to the desperation of the men hiding in the frozen ground, he felt something his training had not prepared him for. Not just fear of the machine itself, but fear of what it represented. The story of why German soldiers feared American Sherman tanks long after the battles had ended is not simply a tale of metal and firepower. It is a story of psychological transformation, of expectations shattered against the reality of industrial might, and of how a medium tank, often dismissed by military historians as technically inferior to its German counterparts, became a symbol of something far more terrifying than its specifications suggested. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank of the Second World War. Its armor was thinner than the German Panthers. Its main gun, the 75mm M3, could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger at combat ranges. American tankers themselves nicknamed it the Ronson after the cigarette lighter, because it lights up the first time, every time, a grim acknowledgement of its tendency to catch fire when penetrated. Yet by the war's end, German soldiers who had survived encounters with Sherman formations spoke of them with a particular dread that transcended tactical analysis. In prisoner interrogations, in letters home, in the quiet conversations of shattered units retreating eastward, the same theme emerged: the Shermans kept coming. To understand this fear, one must first understand what German soldiers expected when they entered the war. The Wehrmacht of 1939 and 1940 was a force intoxicated by its own success. The Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland and France had demonstrated not just tactical superiority, but a fundamental confidence in German engineering and military doctrine. The panzer divisions were the spearhead of a new kind of warfare, one that emphasized speed, coordination, and technological advantage. German tanks, the Panzer III and IV, were considered among the finest in the world, crewed by soldiers trained in combined arms tactics that the French and British could barely comprehend. When German forces encountered Soviet T-34s in 1941, the initial shock gave way to adaptive engineering. The Germans responded with the Panther and the Tiger, behemoths designed to outgun and out-armor anything the Allies could field. The message from German high command was clear. German tanks were superior, German engineering was superior, and therefore German victory was inevitable. This was not mere propaganda. It was a belief system built on tangible success, reinforced by every village taken, every enemy formation shattered. When the first Sherman tanks appeared in North Africa in late 1942, German tank crews assessed them with professional disdain. Intelligence reports noted the Sherman's riveted construction, its high profile making it an easy target, its gasoline engine that burned fiercely when hit. The 75mm gun was adequate against Panzer IIIs and IVs, but struggled against the newer German armor. In individual tank-versus-tank duels, particularly at range, the German assessment seemed vindicated. A single Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann famously destroyed an entire British armored column at Villers-Bocage in June 1944, knocking out 25 tanks and armored vehicles in a matter of minutes. Such encounters fed the narrative of German technical superiority. But the narrative was incomplete. It focused on the individual duel and ignored the larger strategic reality that was already becoming apparent to the officers who understood logistics better than mythology. The true nature of the Sherman's threat revealed itself not in the specifications printed in field manuals, but in the mathematics of industrial production. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 29,497 tanks, the vast majority of them Shermans. By comparison, Germany produced 5,166 tanks and assault guns that same year. The Ford River Rouge plant in Michigan could assemble a Sherman tank in 8 hours. The Chrysler Detroit Arsenal tank plant operated around the clock, with workers, many of them women who had never seen a factory floor before Pearl Harbor, welding, riveting, assembling the machines that would cross the Atlantic by the thousands. When a Sherman was destroyed in combat, another arrived to replace it within days. When a Panther broke down, and the Panther's complex transmission and engine systems broke down frequently, replacement parts might take weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. German tank crews began to understand that they were not fighting against the Sherman as a machine. They were fighting against America's industrial capacity, against an enemy that could afford to lose 3 tanks for every one they destroyed and still advance. Gefreiter Ernst Fischer, a Panzer IV gunner who fought in Normandy, wrote in a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence, "We destroyed 5 of their tanks today. We celebrated until we saw 10 more coming over the hill. Where do they get so many? We are told we have the best tanks in the world. But what does it matter if they have 50 and we have 1? This was the beginning of a psychological shift that would define the German experience of the war's final years. The fear was not of dying to a superior weapon, German. Soldiers had faced death with considerable courage throughout the E2 war, but of dying to a machine that was already being replaced before their own bodies were cold. The Sherman became a symbol of inexhaustibility, of an enemy whose strength lay not in the excellence of individual soldiers or weapons, but in the sheer, overwhelming abundance of both. The Normandy campaign crystallized this realization into terror. After the D-Day landings, German forces in France found themselves facing not just individual Sherman tanks, but entire armored divisions moving in coordinated formations supported by infantry, artillery, and air power. The tactical advantages of German armor, superior guns, better armor protection, mattered less when a single Tiger faced a dozen Shermans attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. American tank doctrine emphasized the swarm approach. Fix the enemy from the front with several tanks, while others maneuvered to the flanks for side and rear shots, where even the mighty Tiger's armor was vulnerable. German tankers nicknamed American armored tactics Kettenhunde-Taktik, junkyard dog tactics, a grudging acknowledgement that the Americans fought without elegance, but with brutal effectiveness. The Shermans rarely attempted to match German tanks in single combat. Instead, they bypassed, surrounded, and overwhelmed through numerical superiority and tactical patience that German units, increasingly short on fuel and ammunition, could not counter. But the fear ran deeper than tactical disadvantage. It was rooted in what the Sherman revealed about the enemy German soldiers were fighting. For years, Nazi propaganda had depicted Americans as weak, decadent, corrupted by racial mixing and democratic softness. The American soldier was supposed to be a poor fighter, lacking the discipline and martial spirit of the German warrior. Yet here were these same supposedly inferior Americans arriving in machines that never seemed to stop, supported by logistics that delivered hot meals, mail from home, ammunition, fuel, and replacement troops with a reliability that seemed almost supernatural to soldiers of the Wehrmacht, who were increasingly eating watery soup and fighting with ammunition rationed to a few rounds per day. A Panther tank might be superior to a Sherman in armor and firepower, But what good was superiority when the Panther had no fuel? German tankers began abandoning their vehicles not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they had no diesel, no spare parts, no ammunition for their excellent guns. They would rig their tanks with explosives and walk away, listening to the detonation as they retreated on foot. And hours later, they would see Shermans rolling past the smoking hulks, heading deeper into Germany. The sound of the Sherman's engine became a particular source of dread. Unlike the powerful but temperamental Maybach engines in German tanks, the Sherman's Continental R975 radial engine, originally designed for aircraft, produced a distinctive high-pitched whine that carried across open ground. German soldiers learned to identify that sound in their sleep. In the months after Normandy, as Allied forces pushed across France and into the Low Countries, German defensive positions would be shattered, not by preliminary bombardment, but by the psychological pressure of hearing Sherman engines in the distance, drawing closer through the night. Soldiers would desert their positions before the tanks arrived, not from cowardice, but from the crushing certainty that staying meant death without purpose. What was the point of dying gloriously when the enemy could afford to lose 5 men for every German killed and still win? The mathematics of attrition became inescapable. Every German soldier killed was irreplaceable. Every gallon of fuel burned could not be replaced. Every shell fired depleted reserves that would never be replenished. But the Americans seemed to have unlimited everything. The winter of 1944-45, when German forces launched their final major offensive in the Ardennes, demonstrated how completely the Sherman had come to dominate German psychology. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, initially achieved surprise and local success. German armored spearheads pushed westward through snow and fog, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the old confidence might be justified. But as the weather cleared and Allied air power resumed operations, and as American armored reserves moved to contain the penetration, German soldiers found themselves facing the same nightmare that had haunted them since Normandy. Endless columns of Shermans supported by unlimited supplies. The German offensive stalled not primarily because of superior Allied tactics, but because German tanks ran out of fuel while American tanks kept moving. Captured German soldiers from the Ardennes offensive spoke of the psychological impact of watching their own tanks become immobile, useless steel boxes, while in the distance they could hear the sound of Sherman engines, always moving, always advancing. One particular incident captured in American after-action reports illustrates the depth of this fear. Near the Belgian town of Bastogne, a company of Shermans from the 4th Armored Division encountered a German roadblock defended by a Panther tank and infantry. The standard engagement would have been a firefight, with the numerically superior American force eventually overwhelming the German position. But before the first shot was fired, white flags appeared among the German infantry. As American soldiers moved forward cautiously, the German infantry commander, an Oberleutnant with an Iron Cross First Class, approached under a flag of truce. Through an interpreter, he explained that his men would surrender, but only if the Americans promised not to shell the nearby village where civilian refugees were sheltering. When asked why he was surrendering when his position was defensible and his tank still operational, the German officer gave an answer that stunned the American company commander. "Because there are 4 of you now, and in an hour there will be 20, and I will not ask my men to die for nothing." The Panther's crew disabled their own tank and joined their comrades in captivity. The recurring symbol in this story is not a weapon or an object, but a sound. The sound of more Shermans coming. Always coming. The acoustic signature of American industrial power made audible. The psychological transformation this created in German soldiers was profound and lasted long after the guns fell silent. In the immediate post-war period, as millions of German POWs languished in camps from Britain to the American Midwest, a curious pattern emerged in their conversations. Recorded by Allied intelligence officers conducting routine surveillance. German soldiers would discuss the war's battles, comparing their experiences, and one topic arose with surprising frequency: the moment they realized Germany would lose. For many, that realization was tied directly to encounters with American armor. Not the first encounter, usually, but the second or third or 10th, when the cumulative weight of American material superiority became undeniable. A panzer grenadier who fought at the Battle of Araucourt in September 1944, where German forces lost hundreds of tanks in a failed offensive, described it in an intercepted letter as watching the ocean try to attack the tide. The metaphor was apt. Individual German units might achieve tactical victories, might destroy more enemy tanks than they lost, but the tide of American armor kept rising, indifferent to local setbacks. What made this psychological wound particularly deep was that it invalidated the entire ideological framework that had sustained German soldiers through years of war. Nazi ideology had promised that will and racial superiority would triumph over material weakness. The German soldier was told he was inherently superior to his enemies, that his weapons were the finest in the world, that German engineering and German courage would overcome any disadvantage in numbers. The Sherman destroyed this illusion not through a single dramatic defeat, but through the slow, grinding reality of attrition. Every destroyed Sherman that was replaced by two more was a visible refutation of the ideology that had sent German soldiers to war. The fear that German soldiers felt toward the Sherman was therefore not simply combat stress or rational assessment of tactical disadvantage. It was an existential fear, the terror of watching one's belief system crumble under the treads of mass-produced machines that should not have existed in such numbers, that could not exist in such numbers unless everything one had been told about the enemy was a lie. This existential dimension explains why the fear persisted long after the war ended. German veterans of the Eastern Front spoke of the T-34 with respect, even admiration, acknowledging it as an excellent tank that had surprised them. But when they spoke of the Sherman, the tone changed. In the memoirs and oral histories collected in subsequent decades, German tank veterans described the Sherman not primarily as a combat vehicle, but as a manifestation of American economic power. Otto Carius, a decorated German tank ace who destroyed over 150 enemy tanks, wrote in his post-war memoir that the Sherman itself was not what made it dangerous. It was knowing that behind every Sherman was a factory that could build 10 more, a supply chain that worked, and an economy that wasn't starving. The fear had evolved into something more complex than combat trauma. It had become an awareness of having fought against not just an army, but an entire civilization's industrial capacity, and having lost not because of inferior courage or skill, but because the enemy could afford to keep fighting indefinitely, while Germany could not. The symbolism of the Sherman took on new meaning in the 20s post-war period as Germany underwent occupation and reconstruction. American forces remained in Germany with their tanks, including Shermans, visible in motor pools and on maneuvers. For German civilians and former soldiers, the presence of these machines served as a daily reminder of defeat, but also as a peculiar kind of advertisement. The same industrial system that had produced Shermans by the tens of thousands now produced consumer goods, automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, all the material abundance that was beginning to flow into West Germany through Marshall Plan aid. The Sherman became retroactively understood as a preview of American economic might, the military expression of a system that could simultaneously fight a global war and maintain the highest civilian standard of living in the world. German soldiers who had feared the endless columns of Shermans during the war found themselves living in a society rebuilding with American aid, watching American movies, listening to American music. The tanks had been the vanguard of a cultural and economic invasion that succeeded where military occupation alone might have failed. By the 1950s, As the Cold War divided Europe and former enemies became allies against the Soviet Union, the Sherman's symbolic meaning shifted again. West German rearmament proceeded under American guidance, and the new Bundeswehr was equipped initially with American weapons, including refurbished Sherman tanks supplied through military aid programs. Former Wehrmacht officers, now serving in NATO, found themselves commanding the same type of tank they had once feared. Training manuals emphasized the Sherman's reliability and ease of maintenance, qualities that seemed almost designed to rebuke German over-engineering. A generation of German tankers learned to appreciate what American tankers had known all along. The Sherman was not the best tank in the world, but it was good enough, and it always worked. This pragmatic excellence, the triumph of reliable adequacy over ambitious complexity, represented a philosophical challenge to the German military tradition that had prized technical perfection over practical effectiveness. The fear transformed into a kind of rueful acceptance, an acknowledgement that perhaps the American approach to warfare, with its emphasis on logistics and mass production over individual technical superiority, had been correct all along. The deeper truth that the Sherman revealed, and that haunted German soldiers long after the war, was about the nature of modern warfare itself. The Second World War marked the transition from war as a test of martial valor and technical skill to war as an industrial and economic competition. The Sherman was the perfect symbol of this transition, a tank that won not because it was the best, but because there were so many of them. Supported by a logistics system that could deliver fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to the front lines, while simultaneously maintaining civilian prosperity at home. German soldiers had been raised in a military tradition that valued the decisive battle, the heroic stand, the technological breakthrough. But the Sherman represented a different kind of warfare, one in which victory went to the side that could outproduce, outsupply, and outlast the enemy. It was a war of accountants and factory workers as much as soldiers, and Germany, despite its technical achievements and its soldiers' courage, had entered an economic competition it could never win. The recurring sound of the Sherman's engine in German soldiers' memories, that high-pitched whine carrying across contested ground, became in post-war testimony a symbol of American abundance. Not just abundance of tanks and ammunition, but abundance of everything: food, fuel, confidence, future. American tank crews ate hot meals and received mail from home with a regularity that seemed fantastic to German soldiers subsisting on bread and ersatz coffee. When Shermans were knocked out, American tankers often survived thanks to better crew accommodations and safety features, then were assigned to a new tank. When German tanks were destroyed, crew casualties were typically higher, and survivors might wait weeks for reassignment. The Sherman represented not just military power, but an entire system that valued individual life and provided for it in ways the German military system did not. This realization, that the enemy cared more for his soldiers' welfare, could afford to care more, was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of fighting against American armor. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, the fear of the Sherman reached its zenith. German soldiers, many of them teenagers and old men pressed into service as replacements for casualties, faced American armor with equipment that barely functioned and training that had been compressed from months to weeks. In this context, the Sherman became mythologized, its actual capabilities less relevant than its symbolic weight. Stories circulated of Sherman formations so vast they darkened the horizon, of American tanks with unlimited fuel pushing east without stopping, of crews who ate chocolate and smoked cigarettes while German soldiers starved. Some of these stories were exaggerations born of trauma and defeat, but they were rooted in the fundamental truth that by 1945, the material imbalance between Germany and the Western Allies was so complete that resistance was not just futile, but absurd. Yet resistance continued, driven by ideology, by fear of Soviet advance from the east, by the momentum of a military system that had forgotten how to do anything except fight. And through it all, the Shermans kept coming. The liberation of concentration camps by American forces, often with Sherman tanks leading the columns, added another layer to the Shermans' symbolic meaning. Survivors of Dachau, Buchenwald, and other camps recalled the sound of American tanks approaching, the same sound that had terrified German soldiers. For the prisoners, the Sherman's engine meant salvation, the end of nightmare. For the German soldiers and SS guards who fled or surrendered, the arrival of American armor meant the final collapse of the Nazi project. The tank that represented American industrial power also represented, in that moment, the moral judgment of history arriving in steel form. This duality, the Sherman as both instrument of military defeat and symbol of liberation, complicated the post-war German relationship with the machine. It was possible to fear and resent the Sherman as a symbol of defeat, while simultaneously recognizing that its arrival had ended a regime that had led Germany to catastrophe. In the decades following the war, as Germany transformed from defeated enemy to Cold War ally to economic powerhouse in its own right, the memory of the Sherman faded from active fear to historical curiosity. But for the generation that fought, the psychological mark remained. Veterans' memoirs and oral histories consistently return to the theme of American material abundance as embodied in the Sherman. They speak of it not with the simple hatred of an enemy weapon, but with a complex mixture of resentment, respect, and a kind of haunted awareness. The Sherman had taught them that courage was not enough, that technical excellence was not enough, that even tactical brilliance was not enough, when the enemy could afford to absorb losses that would cripple a German unit and continue attacking. It was a lesson in the mathematics of modern war, delivered in the form of a medium tank that should have been vulnerable but proved, through sheer numbers and systemic support, to be invincible. The epilogue to this story is not found in a specific place or date, but in the transformation of German consciousness about the nature of power. The fear that German soldiers felt toward the Sherman was ultimately fear of modernity itself, of a kind of warfare where individual heroism mattered less than industrial capacity, where the decisive factor was not the quality of a nation's soldiers, but the efficiency of its factories and the resilience of its economy. The American way of war, symbolized by the Sherman, represented a future in which wars would be won in factories and supply depots as much as on battlefields. Germany, having committed itself totally to a war of ideology and martial prowess, discovered too late that it was fighting an enemy that had turned war into an industrial process, as methodical and inevitable as an assembly line. The Sherman tanks rolling through German cities in 1945 were not just military vehicles, but harbingers of a new world order, one in which American economic power would reshape global politics for the remainder of the century. Long after the last Sherman was decommissioned from American service, long after the veterans who fought in them and against them had passed away, the lesson remained. A tank does not need to be the best to change history. It only needs to be good enough, produced in sufficient numbers, supported by a logistics system that works, and crewed by soldiers who believe their nation will supply them with everything needed to win. The German soldiers who feared the Sherman had glimpsed this truth in the sound of its engine, in the sight of another tank cresting the hill after they had destroyed the first three, in the realization that they were not fighting against a weapon but against an idea. The idea that abundance could triumph over excellence, that quantity had a quality all its own, and that a democracy with its factories humming could outlast any dictatorship, no matter how disciplined its soldiers or advanced its weapons. This was the real reason German soldiers feared American Shermans long after the battles ended. Because the Sherman had proved that the future belonged not to warriors, but to nations that could mobilize their entire economies, that valued practical effectiveness over technical perfection, and that understood war not as a test of martial virtue, but as a problem of logistics to be solved. In that truth lay both Germany's defeat and, eventually, its reconstruction.